So, in our last video, we had finished going through an introduction to the Alcibiades 1 dialogue. We had basically explained who Alcibiades was, and we had very briefly reflected on the main idea, northeast Seauton, as the core of this dialogue, and about the controversies about whether it was a Platonic dialogue or not. So let's start now talking about the different arguments and the different pieces that constitute the Alcibiades. First thing we should state is we know that Plato wrote some plays before he started writing dialogues. This playwriting probably significantly affected the style of texts he writes, like other philosophical writers that were just from before or contemporaneous to Plato tended to write like essays or big long texts or poems about natural phenomena or other topics. Plato adopts this quasi-theatrical structure. In the case of the Alcibiades, this has been reduced to a very bare skeleton. At the beginning of the dialogue, we have just two people, Alcibiades and Socrates. We have to imagine some context which is not provided, but probably some activity has taken place, maybe in a gymnasium or in some other space of the city of Athens, where Alcibiades was surrounded by his friends and admirers. Right now, for some reason or other, Alcibiades has been left alone, and only Socrates is nearby. And Socrates, who has been chasing Alcibiades over the town and over the years, but hasn't been directly talking to him, now starts having a conversation. You could say this conversation, the opening, is something like what we would call Socrates' bait. Remember, Alcibiades is a very young, very successful man in Athens. He has just become an adult and has ambitious plans for himself, mostly going to the agora and getting others to be persuaded by him. He is handsome, he is rich, he comes from a noble family, he is ambitious. So, how can Socrates catch the attention of this gilded youth? So, Socrates begins his conversation by targeting Alcibiades' ambition. Socrates starts explaining that until the present moment he has been chasing Alcibiades, but hasn't said anything to him until now. He's been a quiet suitor, but now his difficult to translate, his protective spirit, the daimon that influences what Socrates does and doesn't do, and basically guides him in actions and also in moral choices, has granted him permission to speak to Alcibiades for the first time. And from his very first words, we can see that Socrates has enough knowledge of character as to be able to guess what sorts of things are attractive to Alcibiades. In fact, they are the things that make Socrates want to become his guide or tutor. That is, a combination of talent plus ambition that needs to be redirected, at least in Socrates' implicit view, towards noble goals, noble deeds, and the examined life, that is to say, philosophy. So, in his first brief baity dialogue with Alcibiades, Socrates' main thrust is, he makes it clear that he knows that Alcibiades wants to speak in the assembly, gain power and glory, and he presents himself as the one person who is uniquely capable of preparing Alcibiades for the achievement of that goal. As we say, and as we will see through the dialogue, there is an implicit aim in Socrates. He actually wants to redirect Alcibiades' ambitions towards self-knowledge and philosophical examination. And with hindsight, we know, and the writer of this dialogue, whether it was Plato or one of his disciples, knows that this project failed with Alcibiades, but it might succeed with others. So the dialogue gets started. Alcibiades' curiosity gets picked. This suitor of his is not after his good looks or his fortune, but into feeding and becoming the unique mentor that can guide him to achieve his objectives. So Socrates starts asking Alcibiades, who has more or less confessed that yes, he wants to go to the assembly and persuade people to listen to him and to do what he asks. The assembly in Athens took place in the Pnyx, a little hill, and there was some order, I think, in who could speak to the crowd. Alcibiades would have had facilities for doing this, being young, handsome, attractive, rich, and aristocratic. So the first part of the dialogue between Socrates and Alcibiades is a subtle undercutting of Alcibiades' authority and of his right or ability to be indeed capable of speaking in front of the assembly and persuading people. Like Socrates asks him pretty bluntly, why should anyone in the assembly want to listen to what Alcibiades has to say? So they start the dialogue. What does the assembly discuss? And, at this time in Athens, the assembly was mostly occupied with politics, especially foreign politics, also taxation and rules and whatever. But the most important issue, the most glorious one also and appealing, would be debating issues of war and peace. So Alcibiades says, this is what the assembly discusses, and Socrates then presses him on what expertise would one need for advising on war and peace. I mean, if you are to talk about some aspect and to give advice to others, you supposedly should know more about this than others do. So Socrates asks him, what is the source of your expertise? Why do you know more than the average Athenian about aspects of war and peace, such that they would be willing to listen to you and such that they should listen to you? So there is an interchange of different questions, and after a few of them, Alcibiades is more or less led to admit that decisions about war and peace rely on justice. They need to be made justly. So the relevant expertise for deciding questions of war and peace and of giving advice on questions of war and peace would be knowledge of the just and of the unjust, of the fair and of the unfair. And of course, being pressed a little bit more, Alcibiades cannot claim that he has learned this expertise either by searching for it on his own or from a teacher. So if he doesn't have the expertise, how is he supposed to convince others of what to do? Okay, this leads to some verbal skirmishes, some back and forth. So Alcibiades makes a first retreat. So he can't claim that he had a teacher or that he secretly researched and investigated about what is fair and unfair. So he makes what seems like a pretty reasonable first retreat by saying that he learned from the many. So Alcibiades claims that some things like justice can be learned just by growing up in the city and, by interacting with other people. You just learn these things without a tutor, but, at large. An example that is given is language. I mean, you learn speaking Greek in classical Athens just by listening to other people speaking Greek. Socrates counters that the many can only teach what they genuinely know. So language is a good example. The many, the masses, know the language, know Greek, so they can teach Greek. But if the many should not know what justice is, they wouldn't be able to teach justice. So the many can't have taught Alcibiades. So this cuts away this retreat. Only what is known can be taught. If you don't know it, you can't teach it. Okay, so Alcibiades takes a second path, which again seems pretty reasonable to us today, and he says, well, the important thing is that the assembly does not really deliberate on what is just or fair, or that's not really what's important when deciding issues of war and peace. It's a more cynical matter of just debating what is advantageous, what is profitable to the city. So it's the advantageous versus the just, which is really the topic of debating at the assembly. And here Socrates leads him to a kind of logical contradiction, which he weaves in a very smart way. So, well, first thing, Alcibiades hits him twice with one argument that he doesn't delve into is, again, you have the same problem as with the previous argument of knowing about justice. Where did you learn what is advantageous? Like Socrates' gambit here is that what is good for you, what is advantageous, is not something trivial. It also requires having been learned either from others who know what is advantageous, from teachers, or from self-research, or from the masses. But this would imply that the masses know what is advantageous. And sometimes you can see the masses adopting policies that are clearly not to their own advantage. So this is one thread that you could take, but Socrates takes it in another direction. He says, okay, let's not discuss again if you have the knowledge or not. Let's just discuss another thing that you are saying. So you're saying the advantageous is more important than the just. I will say, Socrates, that the just is the advantageous, that you can't separate the justice from advantage, that everything that is just is advantageous, which on the face of it seems like rather a contradictory or weird statement to make. But Socrates will make a logical chain, one which we can disagree with. This is pre-Aristotelian and pre-modern logic. But basically he makes the following chain of arguments. The just implies the admirable implies the good, and the good implies the advantageous. So uniting the two, the beginning and the last pieces of the chain, the just is advantageous. So what are the steps? Step one, the just is admirable. So he says, Socrates gets Alcibiades to recognize that things that are just inspire admiration, bravery, courage. Andrea is given as the example. So we admire brave people and we don't admire cowardly people. So something that is just, like being courageous, is also admirable. And that's the first link in the chain. Just is admirable. And the next link, the admirable is the good. It's a bit more tricky, but basically, Socrates says, the admirable is the good, and Alcibiades presents a counterexample with the example of courage. Yeah? And he says, but you don't want to die in battle, so you like courage, but you can't say the admirable is good, because something admirable like courage can lead to your death because of bravery in battle, and death is bad, or any form of harm. And Socrates answers back by making a distinction. He says, you have to separate courage, or the admirability of courage, from the harmful consequences that it might imply. There is a big separation here. Like, what you admire in courage is not that it can get you killed. It's that it's admirable. Yeah? The fact that doing something that is admirable can bring along harmful consequences does not mean that the courageous, that courage is bad in itself. It just means you have to separate. There's one aspect of courage, which is what you admire, and then there are other things that are not courage that can come along. And this separation plays an important role. So now that we accept that the admirable is good, the next step is now the good is advantageous. So the reasoning that Socrates makes is that the good is advantageous because good things are those that contribute to flourishing and success. So if you have conceded all the steps in this chain, you inevitably have to conclude that the just is the advantageous. Yeah, remember all the steps. First, things are just, like bravery or piety, but bravery is the example given. Alcibiades accepts that just things, especially bravery, are admirable things. He then gets forced to admit that things that are admirable are good because any bad elements that are associated with them are not intrinsic to the reason why we admire them. And therefore, these admirable things are good. And finally, the last link of the chain, what is good is advantageous. That is, the things that are good will lead you to live a life of success and of flourishing. And therefore, if you accept all the steps in the chain, the just is the advantageous. This leads to Alcibiades feeling confused and destabilized. He says, I don't know what I'm saying. Socrates has cajoled him into the place where he wants him to be. And to conclude today's video, Socrates finishes by showing Alcibiades is in like the worst epistemic position. Like there are some people who know and there are some people who don't know. And among the people who don't know, it's worse if you don't know that you don't know than if you know that you don't know. And Alcibiades doesn't know and thinks he knows, which is the most dangerous position possible. Like if you know what is correct and what to do, you can give advice. If you don't know, but you know you don't know, you just shut up so as not to say anything stupid. But if you don't know and you think you know, that is when all foolishness comes around, because you give advice that is going to be counterproductive. So Alcibiades is confused because he mistakes his ignorance for knowledge. And we will leave this video here. In the next section, we will go on to see who Alcibiades has to compare himself with.